I was born with an unusual feature. Since childhood, I have been attracted to mirrors, but not in the way it happens to ordinary people. My reflection has always seemed to me like a living being that is just waiting in the wings. My mother often found me talking to myself in the mirror, but I knew someone else was there. As a teenager, I began to notice strange things. Sometimes my reflection was delayed by a fraction of a second or did not repeat the movements exactly. While working as a photographer, I began to specialize in portraits, and I especially loved taking pictures of people with their reflections. Once at a flea market, I found an antique floor mirror in a carved wooden frame. The seller, an elderly man with shaking hands, did not want to sell it for a long time, muttering something about damn glasses. But the money won out, and I took the mirror to my studio. At first, everything was going fine, until one day I noticed something strange in the background of one of the client's photos. Behind her, in the reflection of the mirror, a figure that could not be in reality was clearly visible, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, looking directly into the lens. I put it down to glare or a film defect, but when I showed the photo to the client, she turned pale and ran away. After this incident, I began to study my work more closely. Several photos showed similar anomalies people I definitely didn't photograph. I was particularly alarmed by the fact that these figures never appeared in reality, only in the reflections of mirrors. I started collecting information about the previous owners of the mirror and came across some interesting facts. It turned out that the mirror belonged to a wealthy family that suddenly disappeared in the 50s of the last century. The investigation has reached an impasse. There are no signs of violent death, no signs of struggle. Just an empty house with all my personal belongings and that mirror in the living room. Since then, the mirror has changed hands, with each owner getting rid of it a few months after purchase. My curiosity turned into a real obsession. I set up cameras around the mirror, recording what was happening around the clock. At night, strange things began to happen in the studio. Footsteps, rustles, barely audible moans. I couldn't see anything specific on the recordings, but I could feel someone's presence. One evening, I was working late processing photos. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when I heard a distinctive sound, the creaking of the floor behind my back. When I turned around, I saw my reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. My copy was holding a photo that I didn't have. It depicted those missing people smiling happily before their last disappearance. At that moment, I realized that the mirror somehow retains the traces of those who once stood in front of it. Not their souls or ghosts, but the physical imprints of real events. But the scariest thing was ahead of me when I decided to conduct an experiment. And installed an old movie camera in front of the mirror, one of those that use real photographic film. I turned on the recording and sat down in front of the mirror, deciding not to be distracted by anything, just sit and watch. At first, nothing happened, only my reflection stared back in silence. But about an hour later, I noticed something moving in the depths of the mirror, not the reflection itself, but something behind it, as if someone invisible was passing behind me. I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard a sound, a soft, barely audible rasp, like fingernails scratching glass. The camera continued to work, and I forced myself not to move, even though everything inside me screamed for me to get up and leave. And then something happened that I couldn't explain in any way. My reflection disappeared for a second. At all. The only thing left in the mirror was the empty room behind me. I jumped up, my heart pounding, so hard it seemed like it was about to jump out of my chest. But when I took a step back, the mirror showed me again. Only now my reflection looked strange. It stood completely still, even when I was breathing or moving. It looked like a photograph, a frozen frame, not a real reflection. I tried to calm down, told myself that it was just fatigue, a trick of the light, whatever, but the mirror was already starting to change. Every day, I noticed new details. Sometimes, when I looked into it, my reflection did something that I didn't do. For example, one day I saw it taking out an object from my pocket that I didn't have there. I checked my pocket and it was empty. Or another time, I was standing in front of the mirror, lost in thought, and my reflection suddenly turned and looked somewhere to the side, although I didn't even move. It wasn't a lag or an optical illusion. It was something else, something real. One evening, I found an old notebook in my studio that I had never seen before. She was lying on the table, right next to the mirror, and I knew for sure that she hadn't been there before. Inside were notes written in someone else's handwriting, short phrases, sometimes just words or sketches. One entry in particular caught my attention. "They're staying. They always stay." I sat for a long time rereading these lines and couldn't figure out what they meant. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that the mirror was somehow connected to those words. I started collecting information about the previous owners of the mirror. It wasn't easy. Many of the documents had long since disappeared, and those who might have known something either died or refused to speak. But one day I managed to find a woman who lived in that very house many years ago. She was still a child when the family disappeared, but she remembered a few strange details. For example, she said that on the eve of their disappearance, voices were often heard in the house, although no one but the family was there. And she also mentioned that the mirror was in the living room, and no one wanted to be near it for too long. This story made me think, if the mirror really somehow retains traces of the past, then what if it doesn't just reflect events, but absorbs them? What if it doesn't just show what happened, but becomes part of it? It was an absurd idea, but the more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. I decided to do another experiment. This time, I installed several cameras around the mirror, pointing them at different angles. It was recorded around the clock, and I watched every frame, trying to find at least something unusual. At first, nothing happened, but a few days later, I noticed something strange. On one of the recordings, the camera recorded movement in the room, although I knew for sure that no one was there at that moment. It wasn't a glare or a shadow. Something was actually moving around the room, slowly approaching the mirror. I zoomed in and saw that it was a man. He was standing with his back to the camera, and it was impossible to see his face. But the scariest thing was that he wasn't reflected in the mirror at all. It was as if the mirror ignored him, didn't want to show him. I've been working on this video for hours, analyzing every detail, but I still can't figure out what exactly I saw. And then the changes began in me. I was looking at this creature in the mirror that looked like me, but wasn't me. Every day it became more and more independent, as if it had gained its own will. Sometimes I found myself thinking that I was afraid to approach the mirror, especially at night, when silence reigned in the studio, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. But curiosity always overcame fear. One morning I woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. This feeling didn't leave me all day while I was doing my daily chores, making coffee, checking photos, answering customer emails. It wasn't until the evening when I was standing in front of the sink, soaping my hands, that I realized exactly what was bothering me. In the mirror over the sink, my face looked different. Not that it was completely different, but some details were out of place. The line of the eyebrows seemed sharper, the corner of the lips was slightly raised, and the look was cold, completely alien. I shook my head, telling myself it was just fatigue or a trick of the light. But the longer I looked, the stronger the feeling became that there was something else hiding behind my face. Something that watches me from the depths of the mirror. I turned away, rinsed my face with cold water, and went back to work. However, I couldn't concentrate that evening. My thoughts kept returning to what I saw in the mirror. The next day, I decided to make a little observation. I set up a tripod with a camera in front of a large mirror in the studio and started recording. At first, nothing happened. I was sitting in an armchair, flipping through old magazines, sometimes glancing at my reflection. It behaved as usual. It repeated my movements, reflected every little thing. But after about an hour, I noticed that something had changed. When I looked up, my reflection did the same, but with a delay. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send an icy chill through my chest. I froze, not looking away. And then something happened that made me jump out of my chair. My reflection smiled. Not the way I smile. Quickly and involuntarily, but slowly, almost mockingly, as if it knew something I didn't. I stumbled back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection continued to smile, even when I was no longer looking at it. I forced myself to pick up the camera and review the recording. In the video, Everything looked normal, no smiles, no delays. I'm just sitting in an armchair and looking in the mirror. But I knew exactly what I had seen with my own eyes. It wasn't a hallucination. After this incident, I began to notice more and more oddities. Sometimes passing by the mirror, I caught out of the corner of my eye how my reflection was doing something that I hadn't done. For example, turning its head to the side or raising its hand. I tried to photograph it, but the pictures always turned out to be the same, an ordinary reflection, no different from reality. One evening, I heard a strange sound in the studio. It was a soft creak, like someone slowly running a fingernail across glass. I froze listening. The sound came from the mirror. I broke out in a sweat, even though the room was cool. I moved closer, tried to keep a safe distance. In the mirror, my reflection stood calmly, but something in his posture seemed unnatural. It was as if it was waiting for something. I reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, but stopped at the last moment. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't do this. Instead, I took out a flashlight and shone the beam of light on the mirror. The glass glittered, reflecting the light, but in the depths, where my reflection should have been, I saw a shadow. She moved on her own, out of sync with my movements. The shadow was blurry, indistinct, but the outline of a human figure was discernible in it. I tried to calm myself down by saying that it was just an optical effect, but the longer I looked, the more convinced I became that this was not the case. The shadow began to take on a clearer shape, and I realized that it didn't look like me. It was someone else taller, broader in the shoulders, with a different head shape. I took a step back, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. At that moment, I realized that the mirror doesn't just reflect reality. It somehow captures what is happening around it, but not in the way cameras or photographs do. It was like a recording that plays back with glitches, showing not what was, but what could have been, or whatever it will be. I stumbled back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection continued to smile, even when I was no longer looking at it. I forced myself to pick up the camera and review the recording. In the video, everything looked normal, no smiles, no delays. I'm just sitting in an armchair and looking in the mirror, but I knew exactly what I had seen with my own eyes. It wasn't a hallucination. After this incident, I began to notice more and more oddities. Sometimes passing by the mirror, I caught out of the corner of my eye how my reflection was doing something that I hadn't done. For example, turning its head to the side or raising its hand. I tried to photograph it, but the pictures always turned out to be the same, an ordinary reflection, no different from reality. One evening, I heard a strange sound in the studio. It was a soft creak, like someone slowly running a fingernail across glass. I froze listening. The sound came from the mirror. I broke out in a sweat, even though the room was cool. I moved closer, tried to keep a safe distance. In the mirror, my reflection stood calmly, but something in his posture seemed unnatural. It was as if it was waiting for something. I reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, but stopped at the last moment. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't do this. Instead, I took out a flashlight and shone the beam of light on the mirror. The glass glittered, reflecting the light, but in the depths, where my reflection should have been, I saw a shadow. She moved on her own, out of sync with my movements. The shadow was blurry, indistinct, but the outline of a human figure was discernible in it. I tried to calm myself down by saying that it was just an optical effect, but the longer I looked, the more convinced I became that this was not the case. The shadow began to take on a clearer shape, and I realized that it didn't look like me. It was someone else taller, broader in the shoulders, with a different head shape. I took a step back, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. At that moment, I realized that the mirror doesn't just reflect reality. It somehow captures what is happening around it, but not in the way cameras or photographs do. It was like a recording that plays back with glitches, showing not what was, but what could have been, or whatever it will be. I began to notice that it wasn't just the mirror that was changing. Sometimes I found things in the studio that I didn't remember putting there. For example, one day I found an old photo on the table that I definitely hadn't taken myself. It was a picture of me, but surrounded by people I'd never met. They were standing behind me, smiling like we were old friends. The background was blurry, and it was impossible to tell exactly where the picture had been taken. This discovery made me think. If the mirror really captures events, then what if it can show not only the past, but also the future? What if those people in the photo exist in reality, but I haven't met them yet? Or even scarier, will I never meet you? I decided to do one last experiment. This time, I left the camera running all night and went into another room. In the morning, watching the recording, I saw something that made me go cold. The video showed me entering the studio, sitting in an armchair, and starting to read a book. But I definitely remembered that I had spent the whole night in my room without leaving. It wasn't me. It was my reflection coming out of the mirror. Now I watched the video over and over again, trying to figure out how this is possible. The man in the recording looks exactly like me, but there is something subtly different in his movements, in the way he holds the book, the way he bows his head. It's like someone has studied my habits very carefully and is now copying them, but not perfectly. Sometimes he pauses where I wouldn't, or turns the page too abruptly. I decide to check the reality of what is happening in the simplest way. I leave a note on the table with a question, "Who are you?" and I go into the next room. An hour later, I come back and see the answer, written in my own hand, "You know who." My heart starts beating faster, but I force myself to stay calm. It could have just been someone's stupid prank, although I know for sure that no one was in the studio. For several days, I live in constant tension, constantly looking over my shoulder and checking the corners of the room. But the real shock awaits me when I accidentally hit the mirror, and it falls, cracking diagonally. At that moment, I notice something strange. A crack divides my reflection into two parts, and one of them moves independently of the other. I rub my eyes, thinking it's a trick of vision, but the effect remains. Every day the crack gets wider, and the reflection gets more and more strange. Now it sometimes shows fragments of other places, a corner of antique furniture, a piece of wallpaper with an unfamiliar pattern, part of a window overlooking a completely different landscape. I'm starting to notice that these fragments appear when I'm particularly passionate about my work or when I'm thinking deeply. One day, I decide to spend the whole day watching the mirror. I settle into an armchair with food and a thermos of coffee. At first, nothing happens, but by evening I notice someone's hand appearing in the crack. It's not ghostly or blurry. It's a real human hand that is slowly moving across the surface of the mirror on the other side of the crack. The hand belongs to a woman, judging by the slender fingers and neat manicure. I want to scream, but my voice gets stuck in my throat. The hand disappears, and instead a face appears, pale with large dark eyes. The woman looks directly at me, but her gaze goes right through me, as if she sees something behind my back. Her lips are moving, but I can't hear a sound. Then she disappears too, leaving behind only a faint smell of old books and dust. These observations make me change my attitude towards the mirror. I no longer perceive it as an ordinary piece of furniture. Now it is a window into another reality that exists parallel to ours. And the more I learn about this reality, the more I realize that it's not so empty. One day, I notice that some of the objects in my studio are starting to change. For example, the photos on the wall turn out to be hung in a different order, although I remember exactly how I hung them. Books that I've never bought appear on the table, and there are things in the cupboards that don't belong to me. All this is happening for no apparent reason, and no one but me has access to the studio. Gradually, I begin to notice a pattern. Changes occur only when I look in the mirror for a long time. It's as if my gaze activates some mechanism that allows two realities to exchange fragments of each other. I decide to test this theory by setting a timer camera next to the mirror. She takes a picture every 5 minutes, even when I'm not in the room. A few days later, I look through the photos and discover an amazing thing. In some of the pictures, my studio looks completely different. There are other pieces of furniture, unfamiliar paintings on the walls, and in the corner there is an antique fireplace that never existed. But the strangest thing is that I see people in these photos. They're sitting in chairs, standing by the window, or just passing by. And they all look absolutely real, No signs of ghosts or hallucinations that I've been looking at these photos for hours, trying to figure out what's going on. The people in the pictures look absolutely real. They have shadows, they interact with objects in the room, and they leave footprints on the floor. But the scariest thing is that sometimes I recognize their faces. These are people I've met in my life: an ex-girlfriend, an old school teacher, an upstairs neighbor. But they all disappeared from my life a long time ago. Someone left, someone died. One morning, I wake up to a strange sound, like someone rearranging furniture in the studio. I cautiously approach the door and look inside. What I see makes me freeze in place. There is indeed someone in the room, several people whom I saw in photographs. They walk around the room, talking to each other, touching my things. And the most incredible thing is that they don't pay any attention to me, as if I'm not there. I decide to test my theory and reach out to the nearest person, a middle-aged woman in a light dress. My fingers pass through her shoulder, as if through air. She doesn't even notice it, continuing to look at the photos on the wall. I try to do the same with others, and the result is the same. These people exist in reality, but it is impossible to touch them or attract attention. Gradually, I begin to understand the rules of this anomaly. These people only appear when I look in the mirror for a long time. The longer I watch, the more they become, and the longer they stay. Sometimes they bring with them objects from their world: books, jewelry, clothes. All of this remains in my studio, becoming part of my reality. But the scariest thing happens when I notice that the changes are beginning to affect me as well. One day I wake up and find that I don't remember the events of the day. There's a notebook with my handwriting on the table, but I know for a fact that I didn't write anything. It describes events that I don't remember, meetings with people, conversations, decisions that I've never made. I'm starting to notice that some of my memories seem alien, like I'm remembering someone else's life. For example, I suddenly remember how I used to play the piano, even though I never knew how to play, or how he lived in another city that he had never visited. These memories are so clear and detailed that it is difficult to distinguish them from the real ones. One day, I find a stranger in my studio, a young man about my age. He stands in front of the mirror and looks at his reflection. I want to ask who he is and how he got here, but the words stick in my throat when I realize it's me. Or rather, it could have been me if I had followed a different path in life. He has different clothes, different hairstyle, different manners. But it's definitely me.